Okay. Thank you so much for sitting. Make sure that. So what we are going to do in class is we're going to divide the class into two parts. And for the first part, we are going to be comparing Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And just sort of like thinking about like what are sort of some of the big like ideas we want to take about. And in the
Are you in the frame?
yes, okay. In the second part, we are then going to think about some of the issues raised in the like other articles you did, which are sort of getting at like what kind of content should this kind of course cover, right? Who should we be talking about in a theory class, and how should we select them? And there's actually an example where I hadn't read one of those articles since the last time I taught this class. I was reading it, I was like, wow, he really gets great marginal.
Yes, he did.
Yes. So we don't necessarily need to agree with them. We're just sort of using them as like starting points for sort of thinking about like what would we like ideally what would we cover in a class like this. Okay, so for comparing Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, we're going to make an awesome chart. We're going to have all their main points, comparing all of them. I hope this is appealing to someone because I really like it. Actually, can you test these back? Thank you. And what we're going to do is I'm going to help you with the initial like couple, and then I'm going to divide you all into some like ad hoc just for this one class groups, and you all are going to help fill in some of the next like 3. Okay. I will also be here too. All right. So on your chart, the first cell is about base superstructure, right? Or the first column. Yes. Okay. So if you think about base,
We have division of labor.
oh, okay. Sorry. This is actually goes to the second half because I was sort of thinking about like what do you really need to know about these theorists going forward, and I was like, well, base superstructure is nice, but you know, is it really critical going forward? And I think that arguably division of labor is more salient going forward. All right. So Marx doesn't talk about, like he doesn't really use the term division of labor very overtly, but does he talk about like differences in how people work? Yes. Right, obviously. And so what is his concern about this? Or what is really, if you were telling like your friend or your mom or someone about Marx and what his like your main concerns about like the different things people like jobs do in society, what would you say that was?
The workers are taken advantage of.
Yes, right. So Marx is concerned with like class exploitation, right? They have a division of labor, right, based on ownership of the means of production. And then this leads to like exploitation and also to those 4 types of alienation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when I am writing, I'll use this little arrow with just 2 things to be like, this leads to this, okay? Mm-hmm. So Marx doesn't overtly really talk about the division of labor, but it's implicit in his writing, right? Because he's thinking about class divisions. And if everyone was doing the same work, right? If everyone was a proletariat, we wouldn't have class divisions. Ready to move on to your time? So I believe that the writing that's going to be most relevant for us thinking about your time here is something we did like on the very earliest. One of the first things we talked about your time from like it's actually a writing called The Division of Labor in Society. Right? So Durkheim, does anyone remember any of his thinking related to the division of labor?
That you had two types of society.
Yes, right? That how the division of labor is done is going to determine which of the two types of society. Beginning division of labor as well, okay? The term is kind of a strong word, let's say relate to. So does anyone remember one of the names of his two types of society? Mechanical, yes, right? And I always remember this by remembering that M comes before O, so mechanical comes before organic. Right, so mechanical, not necessarily using like fancy terms, but does anyone remember how the division of labor is in a mechanical solidarity society? Well, right, so essentially everyone is doing the same thing. Whereas in an organic solidarity society, what is the division of labor there?
Doesn't it happen
Hmm?
Doesn't it happen naturally?
I mean, it does kind of happen naturally, but is everyone doing the same thing?
No, it's highly different.
Yes, right? So it's highly differentiated, where you have everyone doing different specialized things. And we know that Durkheim also sees the division of labor here as being related to individualism, right? Where in the organic solidarity society, because they're doing different things, there's more capacity for like individual agency and whatnot to emerge. Really, he's down here, but I'm gonna put Weaver up here so you all can see better, okay?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have started this up higher so I did not reach the bottom of the board. Okay, all right. So Weber is another theorist, which he doesn't in the works we've read really overtly discuss the division of labor. But can anyone sort of thinking back on his theories think where it might come up? He was a Protestant work ethic, right? And so is there like a theory of the division of labor in there?
I think the division of labor happens because we are called to work.
Right? So we can see that it's intertwined with the Protestant work ethic, right? So with Weber, we'll remember Protestant work ethic. With a Protestant ethic. And then a point that Royce doesn't make as much in his early sections on Weber that I kind of wish he did, is that Weber is also very interested in the development of theocracy. Do you all feel like you got that from the readings? Not really.
Yeah.
Like
Lots of notes on
Weber is actually considered one of the fathers of public administration because he's sort of thinking about with his like rationalization, right? We talked about where everything's becoming more sort of like organized and structured and related to profit. That Weber is really sort of looking at this like bureaucracy, right? As part of rationalization. And we all generally know what bureaucracies are, because literally almost every organization we interact with in contemporary society is one, right? So the university, for example, is a bureaucracy. Unless you are self-employed or work for like a mom and pop shop or something like that, your job is probably a bureaucracy. So in a bureaucracy, does everyone do the same work? No, right? In fact, according to Weber, ideally in a bureaucracy, everyone's work is going to be really specified by rules. Does that make sense? So, and I don't know how true this necessarily is in reality, but ideally there are very specific like job descriptions that are very like, clearly defining what everyone does. Right? It's getting at this like legal or bureaucratic authority, which we definitely talked about. And so we need division of labor for bureaucracy, right? So we're seeing it coming in here. Right, and Weber just sort of thinks that like, Weber is interesting because he doesn't seem crazy about bureaucracy, right? He suggests we might get trapped in this iron cage of rationality. But at the same point, he also sort of thinks modern society can't work without it. So he sort of has a love-hate relationship with bureaucracy. So there's the implicit division of labor in his theory. All right, questions? Okay, the next column I give you is class, right? Okay, is this helpful or do you want to skip to the other one? Okay, okay. And I'm sorry that I did not leave enough room for Weber. The only one of these theorists that I really ever use in my own research, and I got enough room for him. So.
Poor guy.
Okay. So with class, we again sort of have a situation where it's more explicit in some theorists, and then it's more sort of like an implicit, where they don't necessarily overtly talk about it as much, but we can sort of see how it connects back there. All right. So how does Marx define someone's class? Yes. And what determines if you're proletariat or bourgeoisie?
Whether you're working or not.
Yes, right?
Whether you're the owner or the worker.
Yes, right? So your relationship to the, yes,
And I'll say that like feudalism.
Yes.
versus capitalism.
yes, right? But under capitalism, what determines your class?
That was your bourgeoisie.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
So it's your relationship to the means of production, right? Which under capitalism is factors. If we go back to feudalism, you have a different means of production, so you have different classes, right? But in capitalism, our means of production is factories. So we have the bourgeoisie. And what is their relationship to the factories? They own them, yes. And we have the proletariat. And what is their relationship to the factories?
The workers.
Yes, they're working on it. All right, so you have a good understanding, I think, of Marx's thoughts about class. Although all of Marx's thoughts relate to class, but this is really sort of like if we're getting some highlights. Okay. Durkheim here is sort of one where Durkheim does not necessarily have a very overt discussion of class, right? It's not a main theme in his work the way it is for the other two. But it is sort of interesting in that Durkheim actually sort of, he thinks that poverty and also strong class divisions protect against anarchy, right? Remember how we talked about like people who win the lottery, there's so much money, they might get out of control, whereas when you're poor, you don't have to decide, should I buy a jumbo jet or should I buy like a poisonous octopus to go in my swimming pool? And so Durkheim sees class divisions and poverty as protecting against anarchy. And we could potentially go further than that, but this is a lot of information you all are taking in, and we don't necessarily need to. So unless anyone really wants to go a lot further than that, we can stop there. Okay. Incidentally, this chart is just for you all, we're not handing it in or anything like that.
I help us understand.
I just like a chart. Okay, and then, again, we're gonna put Weber here. So, unlike Durkheim, Weber definitely explicitly talks about class, right? So he literally has a reading, and I don't remember the first part, but the subtitle is Class Status Party. So does anyone remember, or you can quickly consult your notes, how Weber defines class?
Determination of class situations defined by market situation.
Yes, right? So that is sort of like,
It's like what's possible.
so it's like what you own and your capacity to get more, right? So what you own and then your like opportunities in the market or your like chances of earning more. I'm writing opportunities to get more because it's easy to understand, but don't actually write that in your paper, okay? Write something that sounds fancy. Don't worry about being too fancy, but be fancier than this. You find the right amount of fancy. All right, but is this the only thing that, like, way that Weber is thinking about inequality?
No.
No. So what is another sort of aspect to inequality that Weber thinks about? Status, right? And we know a lot about status because we read Ridgway's whole article. But can anyone go back and think about, like, just essentially what do we mean when we say status here?
Your respect.
Yeah.
Within a society.
Yeah,
Your
some
honor.
yeah, honor, prestige, respect. And in my opinion, how we talk about status and class in American society today are really sort of intertwined. In a way that makes it hard to distinguish these two. Because I think often when people think they're talking about class, what they're actually talking about is status. Right? If I say that like someone's gold toilet is tacky, I'm making a judgment about like a status judgment, right? But I might like use words that have to do with class. And then what is the last type of inequality here?
Social order.
Party or power. And they're sort of, Weber says party, but the really sort of key takeaway from that is power, right? Who has power in society, and that different groups might be seeking power. All right, any questions about this? Okay, so what I would like you to do now is you all are going to use these giant pieces of paper, and you are going to make your own, like, for one theorist, you are going to like fill in some more things, okay? So I'm gonna assign you, I'm gonna put you in like a temporary group. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to make these rules.
That's a good idea.
Also, this is like a coercive situation where I have all the authority, so my rules. They're not that. And what I'd like you all to write about for each theorist in your groups. Is it okay if I raise this stuff on questions? We're going to think about their main interest or concern regarding literature. community. And you'll notice that these match sections of the Royce book, right? So, like, hopefully, we're going to think about their understanding of human nature, or sort of like the individual in society. And then I'm going to go with their views on capitalism. And Royce has also included their views on socialism. This is not actually something that most texts on them include. I actually did not know some of this thing about like Durkheim and Weber and socialism until I read this particular book. So you're welcome to include that. But one of my goals for this course is to give you knowledge that, like, if someone were looking at your transcript and saw you took this class, they would expect you, they would sort of generally expect you to have. And I'm not too worried about the socialism because I wouldn't, but I don't think people generally would be looking for that. Okay, so how many of you have a copy of the Royce book with you today? Okay, so it looks like we'll be able to have at least one person in each group have a copy. So I'm going to give you all, I'm going to put you in groups, and I'm going to give each group one theorist. So one group's going to do Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and think about, because there's a lot of information in the book, but think about how you can condense it down to something like this, right? Where you're really getting at that key idea. And this will also be good because it'll be really sort of practicing going back and thinking about what is key to know and what's not. Cool. Okay. 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 So you all are going to be a group of 3. You guys ready to Marx? Okay. Do we need to like flip a coin over Marx?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Clark.
And then I'm kind of bad at dividing today. Okay. One person, 2 people from this table are going to merge with Kay and Rebecca to form the Durkheim group. Okay? So why don't we have Clark and Danielle do that? Does that sound good? And then you and you can physically move around as much as you need to, okay? You can move the table and like mode. You can wrap up the place. You don't wrap up the place. And then Aaliyah, you're gonna move up with them, and you all are gonna do bigger, okay? And I'm gonna bring you giant paper. So eventually, you can write what you think on the giant paper. With the Sharpies that I actually have, so someone gave me the cutest closet. It's very exciting. Michelle witnessed it happen.
Yeah.
People love this video. And so when you're done, you will ideally have to put this on the board, and we'll have like our grid. Okay. I'm just gonna for now, and then I'm here in charge of writing. Rebecca is not really and then you'll get I'm going on which writes the tissue.
Other people or I don't know.
Which one?
Yeah.
What about-
Pause the recording.
That was on.
Not, we can make a part now. All right, and so what we're sort of doing here, I know it looks different. Let me take these to into the supply closet again. I'll come out for your marker later. Later. And we're sort of trying to like take some of these theories and synthesize like here are some of the big issues, right? So this is interconnected with all the stuff we talked about for the past 3 weeks, but it may not be in the exact same wording or format. Okay, so which group would like to go first and talk about what you got?
Shouldn't we go in chronological order?
We probably should, but I was trying to give you all some motivation. Okay.
We're 2 women and a baby.
Okay. All right. So
That's
please
good.
tell us, what is Mark's worried about with modernity? And you can.
Yeah, so modernity, obviously has the emphasis on exploitation, immiseration, and alienation. Basically how sort of workers and due to the factory conditions and sort of things like who owns the meat production, things like that, can sort of lead to this sort of exploitation and just sort of feeling misery and feeling alienation from society itself, especially among the working class. And yeah, I also thought that this sort of different revolutions brought an entire change of thought as well. And sort of summary of that. And in terms of individualism, he basically had a new economic order and a new kind of individual emerged from this modernity and new kind of individualism. And sort of how it sort of transferred from personal relations into more monetary ones. That sort of money became a lot more important. And lastly, he believed that the capitalist mode of production is the foremost obstruction to individual freedom in the modern world. And in terms of this capitalism, he pretty much viewed it as the enemy of freedom. And he also saw it as a stepping stone from the pre-industrial age that we had before and into more of a communist one in the future. And pretty much lastly, it's all about the ownership of the production, how that sort of leads to this alienation and exploitation that we talked about.
All right, excellent job. All right, so we know that Marx is very concerned about the working class, right? And the plight of the working class in the modern capitalist society, right? When he thinks that people are being restricted from living their freest selves by capitalism, right? And Royce doesn't mention this as much, but I just want to add, so we think about this here. And you're really good for not mentioning it, or like, because this is just for learning, but also because Royce, I wish he talked about it a tiny bit more. But Marx, at one point, he literally refers to humans as Homo faber. Right, so you know how our species is named like Homo sapiens, so Homo has something to do with being a person. In this case, right, it's like a Latin nomenclature thing. Faber has to do with working, right? So Marx is really thinking about human nature in terms of work. And so Marx actually thinks that like in our freest selves, we'll still be working, we'll just be working for whatever we want to work on, not what some factory order is telling us. Does that make sense? So I would just go ahead and maybe make a note of that, just because like Marx's like wildest dreams for humanity still involve everyone working. Sometimes I'm like, no, if I just need like a mental health month or something. Okay, excellent job with Marx. Okay,
We're team dirty.
all right.
Told you I wasn't gonna say.
And you are welcome to come up here or to explain from back there.
My explaining. I'm gonna sit right here.
Okay.
So with Durkheim, which interestingly to your point about you're gonna see that as we get into other scholars that you don't have memorized, you have to reference check more. I felt that way about Marx versus Durkheim versus Weber, like very intently. And Durkheim is the one that I know the least.
I feel, on the one hand, I feel bad for putting you in that group. On the other hand, it's good because that means you're learning.
Yeah, no, I'm good. It's okay. Like this is gonna make me remember it more than anything
It's
else.
just more that you will see in some of the couple weeks that I'm more learning with you.
It's gonna be
Okay.
good.
Yes, I
Okay.
understand.
So in regards to the main concern or issue around modernity, he was really concerned with our loss of morals, kind of this decline in collective conscious or anomie, like he wrote about. So that he was worried that essentially we were going to get depressed and like lose our morals because capitalism is going to take those away.
Mhm. And that we're in this transition between the two types of society,
Yes.
right?
The
So,
pre-modern and modern.
yes, so this is excellent. Just to, the one thing I would add to contextualize it a little bit is that he's worried about this because he sees society as being in this transition period.
I didn't catch that, so that's great.
And this is also part of this, I know, because I've read like other books under time. Because I've spent a lot of time with these theorists. And so that's really sort of why he's worried that in this transition, we're losing our moral regulation, we're losing our collective consciousness, and that makes us vulnerable to things like anomie. All right, excellent. Now tell us about the individual and or human nature.
So the individual or human nature, we really focused on this one quote that he had, but really his ethos around this is that human nature is necessarily social. So there is really no individual because we are all acting from a social framework, from a group understanding of rules. None of us are really acting from a purely individualistic moral code.
That's exactly right, right? And we see that, just to give you an example, in the study of suicide, so that's something we see as being very individual. And then Durkheim is saying, hey, I think there's a social level factor, right? So he's thinking everything is gonna have to come back to a social level factor. All right. And Team Durkee.
Team Durkee. Finally, we believe that his views on capitalism really go back to his main concern around modernity, because again, his views on capitalism is that it was leading us to a decline in morals. Like we no longer had a moral guide because capitalism and wealth was kind of usurping
Yes.
the moral
Yes.
code,
Yes.
basically created by religion.
And what's interesting here is that he's not worried about this for just one class, right? He's not like poor people are going to lose their morals. He's like everyone might, right? Or their moral regulation. And so it's sort of interesting that he's concerned about capitalism more as an overall phenomena than as one specific group within capitalism. Does that make sense to you all? Okay, excellent work. Okay. Finally, we will have this group. Did you all give yourself the name?
The blue team.
The blue team. Okay, excellent.
Well done.
All right, good work. So who would like to tell us about Weber?
So the main concern, Weber's main concern is that we'll get trapped into this iron cage of rationality, and people will become like more and more specialized, and that will like create this more bureaucracy of an environment, and we'll become more dependent on each other, and where it'll be like almost to a point where it's like new rules or like new laws kind of be put in place because we become so dependent on one another.
So we can actually sort of take this back to the Protestant ethic, right? You were exactly right, right? Where like the Calvinist Protestants Weber is writing about, they're working really hard because they have these theological beliefs, right? That are telling them they need to do this to get into heaven. Really wealthy people who work really hard today are probably not Calvinist Protestants, but they're still doing that. Does that make sense? And so I really wish hamster wheels had existed when Weber wrote, so we could use that instead. But he sort of sees us trapped in this situation where even though we don't have the religious beliefs, we're still doing the behavior. All right, and right, he's worried about what that's going to lead to in terms of like potential long-term effects for society. All right, excellent. Okay, so tell us about the individual. And you guys stole your thunder a little bit, but
So for the individual, we decided to put that Weber sees that each individual has like tied to religion, and that will affect their work ethic. So for example, the Protestant work ethic, like versus people that are Catholic, and also kind of what it is, his main concern is being trapped into that iron cage, which will like, if you're in that iron cage, your class, your status, and your power party may present like biases in order for you to kind of maintain your hierarchy.
right? And then I'm in the iron cage, so I'm really trying to like work hard and like achieve my class, and maybe that should not be my goal in life if I'm not a Calvinist Protestant. Okay, and then we've sort of been getting at this, but how did he think about these like views on capitalism?
So on capitalism, he viewed that even though like it's something you can be trapped in, it was something that we've already kind of become. So it's something that we'll need at this point to survive. So it's like there's no escaping it, and it's just an irresistible social force. That's the word used. That kind of forces us to become engulfed in capitalism.
Right, and this is interesting because Weber essentially kind of thinks here that like modern society has to be bureaucratic and capitalist for it to run. So Weber doesn't really seem to like it, but he doesn't see there being a viable alternative. So it's actually kind of a depressing, like, it's like to be like, well, our society is organized in a bad way, but there's no other way. All right, any questions that you all have? All right, good work, Lucy. Okay, so hopefully this sort of helped you sort of like sum up some like final thoughts about Marx and Durkheim. What I would like us to do now is to take like a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene at 7:30 to talk about the other two readings. I try to follow the-
Yeah.
I'll see you tomorrow.
From my old yeah.
Also very transparent, I like that.
Yes.
So let's think about the other two articles that you looked at for today. So there's the one by Stark and the one by Hamilton. So what did you all think of either or both of these videos?
I was shocked.
You're shocked?
I was.
They were on course then? Okay.
I found it surprising.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was, scandalous. The information would be misreported like that, and it's not even like they're trying to tell somebody that's not familiar with the information, like people in colleges and things that would choose these textbooks. I mean, if you read that, you would be like, that's not right, but it's still the #1 bestseller textbook.
Right, so Hamilton has done a study at the time he was writing of intro to sociology textbooks. And I have to be honest with you all, I never actually took an intro to sociology class. My college had a major that was called anthropology/sociology. But so I never had an intro to sociology class. I never had an intro to sociology textbook. So this was all new to me. And so he is, and I've since then I've gone back and looked at them, but he is really sort of looking at like what theorists, so many intro to sociology textbooks have like a theory section, right? And he's really looking at like what gets included there and how have they changed over time, right? And so what you see here is that like, even who we talk about as like the founding fathers gets changed, like I mean, I don't really see why we have to talk about the founding fathers of sociology. It's not going to like put them on our money or something. But even they change like who like is considered important to talk about in an intro to sociology textbook has sort of changed over time, right? So Marx was not actually included until the 50s. What happened was sort of in the 40s and 50s, there's an American sociologist called Tophet Parsons who sort of took Durkheim's theory of functionalism and really sort of expanded it and made it incredibly complicated. And he has massively fallen out of favor today. Like we're not covering him because no one talks about him and no one agrees with him. And no one would expect you to know anything about him. But so when that happened, there was sort of some backlash to that, where people started, I think, sort of looking for other theories as a reaction to that. I mean, also in like the 50s and 60s, we see more sort of like tensions in society that might have inspired people to look to Marx again. So this is really, so it's sort of looking at that, right? And the main reason I wanted you all to read this is not necessarily so you could develop an opinion on the content of intro textbooks, but so you could sort of think about like how do we choose which theorists are important to read in a theory class or in an intro class or in any class. And the other interesting thing is that so many of these people, right? So we talked about like Marx, Weber, Durkheim, they're sort of like graduate educations, and most of them are not like they're not sociologists per se, right? Like their background is in something else. And Hamilton sort of raises the issue, particularly when he talks about like Harriet Martineau, of like is she doing enough to be considered sociology, right? Or like sort of like to be worth including here. So what do you all think? You don't necessarily think. Like, what did you think of the article? You don't have to have an opinion on whether we should include Harriet Martineau in our intro textbooks.
I've never seen anything that didn't present these three men as the founders of sociology, like ever. And I've never heard of that woman.
And then I feel like on the one hand, I think there are unappreciated women and people of color throughout like the history of disciplines. On the other hand, I see his point that with Harriet Martineau, we may try to sort of force her into like a box that she doesn't fit into in terms of what she was doing. Does it make sense to you all?
Yeah.
I actually think that like I wish some of these focused on Jane Addams' work. And like she was a member of the American Sociological Society. She was publishing in sociology journals. So there's a very strong case for her to be made.
It mentioned her,
Mhm.
right? It was just.
Yeah.
Nonsense.
Yeah, not as much.
Yeah.
But I-
Which her I know more about, like we did,
Yeah.
I studied her a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Where we learned about her in one of our other classes this year.
Yes. But I think it's sort of, it's, intro textbooks will also talk a little bit about Harriet Martineau. And I see his point that like it's sort of unclear, like, is what she's doing close enough to sociology to like think of her as like a sociologist?
But if like you use that, if you use that for her, why would you not say the same to like Marx and other people that were still considered philosophers at the time?
That is an excellent question, right? I mean, to be honest, if I wrote an intro textbook, I would probably not include any theory section because I just don't think that's important when you're like, if you're gonna be like, here's our 1 week of this, and then we're gonna move on and on and on. But yeah, that's a good question. So we might think about like, is what Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are what they are doing close enough? What do you, and like, that's a great point, right? If we're gonna ask that of her, we should go back and ask it of everyone.
I thought it was interesting too that like reading both of these articles, really thinking about like being an American sociology student, that we read the theory that was written by white men in Europe 8 million years ago, when we have people like Dubose and Jane Addams that were actually reckoning with sociological factors in the country, in the society that we're actually in, and yet they are relegated to not being in any intro to sociology that I've been in.
What is actually interesting is occasionally people will be like, we'll send you a free copy of an ebook of our intro textbook, and you can read it and tell us what you think, and then maybe we'll use you in like a blurb on Amazon.com or something. I often say no because I think it's like a free copy of a textbook is not that exciting. But I got one recently and I was like, we teach theory differently, right? And we're not going to do this thing. So there could be like a shift change where this is changing. But this sort of, one of the reasons I wanted to point out when we were talking about how everything is sort of like socially constructed, that even how sociologists talk about sociology is socially constructed, right? Where we're making choices about what we do then, what we take out, what we prioritize, and how they've done that has changed. Okay, let's move a little bit to the Stark reading. So the Stark reading, I wanted to go over a few of these things with you. But one thing, the reason why I assigned this is to really sort of think about to what extent do we think that like being empirically verifiable, right, where we can like go out and find data to like prove it or what support it is important for a theory. And I had typically paired this reading with another sociologist of culture named Jeffrey Alexander, where he is trying to make a case that theories don't necessarily need to, we can get something from these theories even if they aren't like empirically valid. But that reading is really dense, and so I didn't really want you to have to like suffer through it just to think about that question. So Stark is a sociologist of religion. And so, which you can tell because he's really sort of getting into the religion data here. But he gets at some of the critiques we talked about with Weber earlier, that Weber is sort of suggesting that Calvinist Protestants were like the first to be good at capitalism or better at capitalism. But we actually know that the Italian city-states were very good at capitalism.
Excuse me.
Yeah, you're good. Which happened earlier than the Calvinist Protestants, and like they were also good. And Weber attempts to sort of resolve this, like it doesn't quite work, historically, by making his definition of a capitalism really narrow, right? So we can say, but they weren't really doing capitalism, these people were. And Stark isn't really buying it, right? Like he's sort of trying to like make his definition, it seems like, fit the data.
It existed before Weber.
And so one thing we might sort of think about is like, even if it doesn't work historically, has Weber captured something in this theory that is useful for us? Which is not like there's no like definitive yes or no answer to that, right? It's something we can discuss if you want. Like even if we know that the Calvinist Protestants were not like the first to do capitalism well, did the like overall outcome of this theory, has it like taught us anything useful? Or can we use it to understand more about the social world?
I think so. I think so because he points out how the Protestant worked with this idea. Others just worked. You know what I'm saying? And some of them didn't work at all because they didn't want to break their hands. But capitalism existed prior to the Protestant faith and their work ethic. I think.
I was thinking about it as I was reading this. Like it feels like by trying to say that sociology is a science, that we really kind of forced ourselves into some boundaries that we don't necessarily need to be in. So, because yes, there's empirical evidence that we can find in all of those things, but it is not a hard science. And if it's a hard science, like with science, you're just concerned about, is it right, is it wrong? But if you remove that and think about it as like, here's the history of a school of thought around society, and what does the history teach us, and what is the progress of the theory of that field, it gives you more freedom to pull from what was useful from the past and move it into the future.
And that actually, we're a little pushed for time to have a debate, but we could even talk about, should we call sociology a science?
Great.
It's a very big question that we're not going to resolve in like
I think that for this, I don't know, I feel like I am a little tied between two, because if it's not accurate information, it's like, why would you take, 4 or 5 weeks teaching students something that's not accurate? But like, I do understand like Clark's point, where it's like, the history of a theory and where it stems from, the time being, or where it was, like created, does have relevant value, especially if you're trying to like invoke thoughts into new people, and they're trying to, come up with their own theories and things like this, just like a review, an academic review of theories, like what comes out of that is necessary to sociology. So it's like, it does have value, but if it's not accurate, like the amount of time spent teaching on it may.
Yes. Well, I think it stopped. It must have stopped.
Okay.
Because I saw the.
Okay, at the very least, we got the first part of class.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's going again now.
so Stark is a sociologist of religion. He has taken an issue with Durkheim's definition of religion. We don't really need to care about that in a theory class. If I were teaching you sociology of religion, what I would essentially say is there are not really any, like, it's very hard to define religion in a way that includes without becoming so broad that it includes something else. Right? You can make a definition of a religion so broad that you can simply define football as a religion. Right? People gather in special outfits at individual times, at sacred spaces, and perform rituals. And so, like, Stark has his own definition of religion, and it's like, I think it is not also, like, it's, the real thing to get at here is that Durkheim, he's really sort of thinking that, like, religion might be the only thing contributing to moral order. And is that, like, do we buy that or not?
No.
No, right? And that there have actually been a lot of contemporary tests where people have tried to look at this, often using survey data where they know someone's religion, or actually know like country level data where they know like religious demographics about the country and then suicide rates. And what we can see is this really seems to vary cross-culturally, right? So like there are some settings where it looks like Durkheim's understanding like works and then some where it doesn't. The other thing I wanted to let you know, although it's not in the article, is that I don't think Durkheim realizes this necessarily, but he has a problem with some of the data he's using. So Durkheim tells us that both Protestantism and Catholicism condemn suicide, which is true. However, at the time he is writing, Catholicism considers suicide to be what is called a mortal sin, which is like a more serious type of sin. And that at the time, I think this has changed, if someone had committed suicide, they can't be buried in the church graveyard, right? And so would you, if you had to give your relative, like someone's cause of death, what would you say?
Not suicide.
Natural
Not suicide.
causes.
Yes, right? So we suspect that Durkheim may have been using flawed data because there was probably underreporting, right? We think they are probably actually similar, but that Catholics had more of an incentive to not, like both religions condemn suicide, but they do it so in ways where Catholics might have had more of an issue to not report, right? Which can take us back to like the point you got at, like to what extent does it matter, like that his data might have been flawed? All right, and then finally to get through to like Marx, I think Stark's critique of Marx is actually very weak, because he's not really getting at Marx's empirical, like Marx didn't have any data, so you can't really criticize it, right? But since Marx wrote, there's been a lot of people who have tried to look at the relationship between religion and economic class, right? Are poor people more religious because they need this like opiate? What is going on? And there's not really like a clear relationship, right? The poor doesn't make you more religious, the wealthy doesn't make you more religious. What we do see is that they will often do religion differently, right? So like a religious group where like one class might have a slightly different style of music or like way of doing things than another group. And we also see, at least in the United States, clustering in terms of which religions and which Christian denominations people belong to, where we can often sort of like wealthier people tend to be members of certain Christian denominations, and then poor people like might more often be members of others, which relates to like American history and like where they developed in Europe, and then when those people came to the United States and all of that.
I think, didn't this also talk about that one thing that they saw is that generally one of the differences in how class affected how you practice was like, you know the right words, but a more fundamentalist approach to religion from lower classes?
I mean, generally, although the other thing to be careful of here, right, if we're talking about like limited data, is that most of this research has been done in like on the United States using survey data.
Yeah.
And with survey data, if they're like sampling people and they're asking what's your religion, you need like so many people to be able to do anything with the data, right? So if I do a survey of like 5,000 Americans and I only get 10 Buddhists, I can't do any analysis with those Buddhists, because I just don't have enough people. And this is changing, but in the past, if you did a survey, unless you took special measures, you would really only get enough Christians. And so basically, like, everything Stark says we sort of know is about American Christianity, not necessarily about other religions in the US or anywhere else in the world. So
Do you think, being a religion professor, and maybe you don't have, or not professor, but you know, because the other thing about this data is it seems pretty old. Like we're collecting religious information from like the 50s and the 60s. And like there has been a massive shift in our country and decline in religion and all of that in the last 40 years. Does this data that even Stark is noting, is that still even relevant?
I mean, it's useful to know because people like to look at this, right? And because if we saw a change, we want to be like, well, what happened in American society to like now the relationship between religion and class has changed? And we actually then maybe potentially go back to Marx and be like, you know, did something happen? Right now, there's a lot of focus on people who, when asked, what is your religion, say none, like N-O-N-E, not that they're like a nun, 100%, they have none. And initially, people were very interested to be like, is education, so education is typically associated with a higher income, right? Like people with higher education often make more money. They were trying to figure out, is there a relationship between getting higher education and saying that you're an N-O-N-E, like a nun? And I think initially it looked like there might be, but now we're not sure. But this is also a thing where people will really get into very small, like technical fights over like, well, you know, how did you ask this question and things like that. And I think we can really take away when we see people doing those like very like specific methodological arguments is we don't think we know. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. If how you ask the question matters that much, then it just seems like we don't know. Like I think initially we thought there was something. We meaning sociologists, not me. But I think like now there may not necessarily be a relationship there. Sorry, we got farther away from theory than I meant to. And I think this is because Stark, like, I don't know, what did you all think? Like, did Stark make a compelling case that we should like put away any of these theorists?
No.
No.
Well, it just made you think. You could kind of have a filter. on
Yeah.
Just not to believe everything that
Yeah.
people say
Yeah.
about them, like maybe they might not be 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think there were things like we've talked about this in previous classes. There are things that those sociologists couldn't have accounted for, and so you have to keep, I guess, your thought process has to keep evolving because things in society keep changing. So I think not necessarily that you throw the whole, you know, theorist away, but that you keep, you know, progressing.
It reminded me very much of when I was way younger, teens and early 20s, I was very, very into church. And my very first kind of criticism of it and where I started moving away from that was because I noticed that everybody went right along with what the preacher would say without questioning or looking for themselves. It was just like blindly following. And I felt like maybe this was what he was trying to say about these guys. I mean, maybe you should kind of look into it yourself and question it a little bit, not just blindly follow, but they are still relevant.
That's a good point. And to be honest, I feel like people fixate more on Marx's comment that religion is the opiate of the masses, which isn't really sort of central to Marx's writings.
So often misinterpreted. Usually.
All right. So just as we wrap up, I wanted to let you know where we are going for the next couple weeks. unless you all had any, I don't want to cut you off, but. So we are going to start reading this book. I'm gonna read Du Bois. So we're essentially reading the first half of the book for next week, and then the second half of the book for the week after that. The first half of the book, and particularly the introduction and chapter 1, are really theoretically dense. The book gets easier as you go on, but the introduction and the first chapter, in my opinion, are like very theoretically dense. I am going to post on CourseGen some reading notes, just on like telling you some things for like chapter 1, like what you should sort of focus on, and then also some things that you shouldn't like necessarily worry about, because they are connecting Du Bois to like other scholars that we aren't going to read or haven't read yet. Would it work better for you all if I put that in the announcements or the content area? In the announcements, I might put in the announcements, but I'll put in the content area too, just so like it's everywhere and people can find it. But I just wanted to give you all a heads up that like that first bit is theoretically dense, and then it sort of gets easier to read as the book goes on. I'm sorry about that, but it's important information. So, and it is interesting. But so that is where we're going. So I hope you all have a good week. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.